you very much, Yomna. And I don't think you've set me up to fail, but listening to that, I'm thinking, who is that? Is it me? Okay. Thanks very much for having me. Thanks for inviting me here. And it's very nice to see some faces that I already know from my past. Also nice to see other faces that I am meeting for the first time. So my name is Emmanuel Ogbonna, and I work at Cardiff Business School, Cardiff University, where I have been for a very long time. It feels like a lifetime because I joined the business school as a student and then went on to progress, one of those examples of cradle to grave academics, hopefully not to grave, but I have been there a long time. And what I'm going to talk to you today about is some of the research that I've been doing and some of the things that have been exciting me of late. And if you look at it and think about it, when we talk about race, we are always focusing on the negative, and that's because most aspects of race is negative or are negative. We talk about discrimination in the labor market in particular. We look at the statistics, and they are nearly always dire. We are going to look at some of the statistics today, but I want to be more positive. I want to talk to you about some of the things that have been interesting me, some of the things I've been finding in some of the studies I've been doing. And these things have motivated me to want to write about a concept that I refer to as cultural entrepreneurs. And I'm going to discuss that in a few minutes or so. So thank you for having me. Before we start, let me just go through some caveats and say that many of the issues I'm going to talk about today apply to all disadvantaged groups, all the protected characteristics, if you like. So they apply to women, they apply to disabled people, they apply to people that are discriminated on the grounds of religion, sexual orientation, etc., etc. But I just happen to be focusing on race, and I will talk to you in a minute about why I'm focusing on race. And the second point is for us to think about this, which is that black and minority ethnic groups, people often talk about them as though they are a homogeneous group. We all know they are not, but for ease of reference, we refer to them as though they are homogeneous. We know that some of the things affect people in different ways. For example, Chinese groups are actually getting much better results than even many of the white groups. Some Indian groups are doing quite well too. So there are pockets of differences amongst them. But there are also some groups that are doing so badly that we ought to categorize them as a group in that sense. But there are differential impacts on specific groups that make it difficult for us to continue such a narrative without problems. But why do we want to focus on race? I want to focus on race for a variety of reasons. The first thing is this silence around race. We don't like talking about race. Nobody likes to talk about it. In organizations, in society, the moment somebody talks about race, everybody keeps quiet. It's almost like, hang on, I don't know what to say. I don't want to say the wrong thing. And that, in some respects, is understandable. It's understandable because race is an issue that impacts on a small number of people in society. And when you think about it, race is not really a white problem. Race is a problem that ethnic minorities have. Why do I say that? If you ever speak to a group of people, something that I do quite regularly, and then you say to them, you come across a group of sales managers, and you say to them, here's a piece of paper, here's a pen. I want you to write on this piece of paper how your race has impacted on your life. The ethnic minority people in the room will fill up the page of the paper in a second or two and ask for more. The white people in the room will look at you and think, what is he on about? Because this isn't an experience that impacts on their lives. And as such, it's very difficult to get them to begin to think about it. But until you think about race, the impact of race is going to continue. The consequences will become even more profound as we go along, as we have more and more people that are falling into that category, either because more people are being born or because of immigration or for a variety of other reasons. So there's a serious silence around race, when in fact what we ought to do is to talk more about race. So focusing on race is important. Focusing on race is important also because race is a significant marker of identity. It's probably the most significant markers because it is visible. You know, the first thing people tend to see about people is their color, their skin color. So when the police ask people to describe somebody, they start off, if they are different, if they are non-white, the first thing they will tell you is that they are of Asian appearance, they are black, they are this. So because it's visible, it's a serious marker, probably one of the most salient markers of identity. So it's important, and that is why it is a source of difference and a source of discrimination, because it's there for people to see, and it's probably the first thing that people see. So we want to talk about it because of that as well. And the final reason why I think we should talk about race is because we want to be able to elevate race to other bases of discrimination or disadvantage, especially gender. Now, we haven't reached where we would want to be on gender, but with the political discourse is focused on gender for many years now, and things are happening. We're not quite there, but things are happening, more so than on race. In recent years, the political discourse is moved. We now have gender issues that are taken seriously, or at least more seriously than the past. You know, gender representation on company boards backed by the government, and action, you know, in that sense is meant that we now have more, you know, more than double what it was in 2011, not quite where we want it to be. The 30% arbitrary figure of representation, we haven't quite reached there, but we are more than the 11% that it was about 2011 when the discourse started. You know, gender pay gap reporting, every day we listen and hear of what organizations are doing and how illegal or how wrong, morally wrong they are, that people doing the same jobs are being paid different rates, although that's not the full essence of gender pay reporting, but that's one of the things that is emerging from that. Only yesterday, I think, I was listening to the news, and I think Samira Ahmed of the BBC has gone in to say, actually, it's the same job that other people are doing and being paid less than the others. She probably would have a stronger case in that sense on gender than perhaps she might have on race. But race is important, and we ought to be thinking about the pay gap on race. We ought to be thinking about the representation on gender, as we shall see in a few minutes or so. But although I say it's dire, the statistics are dire, I think it's important to start by looking at those statistics on representation. The BME population is 13%. That's the last census, and this was 2011. So if we had another census today, my best guess is that it probably would be about 15, 16%, maybe even more. There are people who've suggested that it would be about 20% BME by the year 2035, 2040, 2050, different sources. But let's focus on what the official statistics tell us. Unemployment rates across board, 3.9%. Amongst the white population, 3.3%. BME, on average, 7.5%. So since the records began, it's always been at least twice as likely to be unemployed, BME population, in comparison with their white counterparts. So there is something there. It gets even worse if you look at specific groups, you know, Bangladeshis, for example, or if you look at specific age groups, or if you look at women, By age group, white groups, 11%, not clever, but the black groups are more than twice again. 24% of young black people are unemployed as our 2018 figures. And then if you look at the Pakistani, Bangladeshi groups, again, quite bad. You look at specific sectors, politics, law, and other, 6% of MPs in England and Wales at BME, which is something that increased significantly at the time of the last election. I wonder what it would be for the next election with all the threats of this election and so on and so forth. 5.9% of judges, 5.5% of police officers. In academia, a point that Yumna made, 0.6% of professors are black. Sometimes I think to myself, it's dire, but maybe it's not so dire for me because I feel guilty that I have benefited from that process. And in a way, that's part of the thing I'm going to talk about today. Why is it that some people are able to succeed out of such adversity? But my guilt comes from, I got into an organization to do, anybody here, and I know there are some people here who do the type of research I do, essentially qualitative, case-driven research, having to go to companies and cap hand and beg and say, please, can I come in and speak to your managers and senior managers? And nearly always them saying, we haven't got the time to give to you. But I remember a company recently that I really, really wanted to study, and writing to them, and then agreeing a meeting with a very senior executive, and going in thinking this will just be, no, we won't give you access, and then doing the spiel and saying how important this study was going to be, et cetera, and how many senior executives we wanted to speak to, and this is a very large organization. And the executive I was speaking to looked at me and said, I will give you access. And the only reason I'm giving you access is because I looked you up online, and you are one of, I think she said something like 6 black professors in Russell Group universities. And I thought, part of me thought, I feel a little guilty, but I'm excited because I'm getting access to study this organization. So something profoundly negative turned out to be somewhat positive for me, in a sense. But I thought, as I'm coming to an engineering department today, I'll look up some of the engineering statistics. Again, very difficult to find, but I came across your Royal Society of Engineering website, and I followed it through, and I was able to discern some figures from that. And 7.8% of engineering professionals apparently are BMEs, but less than 0.5% of BME engineers are on boards of engineering companies. So not good. However one looks at it, not good. Less than 0.1% of engineering professors are BME. Not good at all. So the question then is, how have we traditionally explained these anomalies? We often look at the literature and they will say, oh, hang on, but it's essentially the lack of human capital. These people don't have the skills, the qualification, the education levels to be able to achieve the success we are expecting them to achieve. And then you distill it, you look to the literature and then look at the statistics, the number of people getting degrees and qualifications and training and so on, and you find that that isn't necessarily the case. Actually, one of my earliest examples or experiences in this area of research was in early 1990s, because this wasn't the area that I trained for in my PhD. My PhD was on corporate strategy and corporate culture. And in about 1992, we were approached by the South Glamorgan Training and Enterprise Council, as was then, who said to us, we have some money, we have a problem here. We think that the problem is that ethnic minorities in the South Glamorgan area weren't coming forward to train, and as such, we're not benefiting from employment training. And then we, myself and Professor Mike Noon, who is now at Queen Mary University, looked at it and then studied it, and then found that contrary to what they were thinking, that they weren't training and they weren't getting the qualification, that's why they weren't getting jobs. That ethnic minorities in the South Glamorgan area were coming forward in greater proportion than their proportion amongst the unemployed for training, and that they were actually getting the qualifications from training. But there were two types of outcomes, positive outcomes from employment training. One was for you to get a qualification, and then the other one was for you to get work experience. Now, they were getting more qualifications than work experience because the training providers simply were not taking them forward for the work experience placement. And when we spoke to the training providers, some of them were blunt, and they said to us, the companies wouldn't want us to bring in ethnic minorities. And of course, we want to be paid. And the only way we get paid is if we can take these people to go to the placement. So we continue to take white trainees to them. So it wasn't human capital, is the point. And of course, we know about ethnic penalty. We know the researchers who've tried to sift out the impact of a variety of other factors like qualification, experience, and so on, and have concluded that in fact there is ethnic penalty at play. Other people have said, hang on, it's all to do with social capital. It's all to do with the capacity to develop relationships, to network, to be able to have these relationships of obligation that you can then call on at a later point in the future. And that ethnic minorities are simply unable to develop such relationships, whether they are networks or cultural capital or whatever the case may be. But then discrimination remains the key factor. Discrimination is the key reason, many argue, why people are not succeeding in their chosen careers. We are told that the law has made it difficult for discrimination to be overt, and that what we have instead is covert, clandestine type discrimination. It's underhand, which is very difficult to control, very difficult to understand. It turns into your everyday discrimination. But we also know that that isn't necessarily the case. We still have a lot of evidence of discrimination, as I will share with you in a minute or two. But more importantly, we have this thing now that is called unconscious bias. Unconscious bias really is the bane of my life because I never quite understand how one describes it, because in a way, if you took it seriously, it could actually absolve people of discriminating. And I know this for a fact because I spoke with some senior executives who actually, I remember speaking to a senior executive about an interview, and then I said to him, what do you think about this concept of unconscious bias? And surprisingly, he didn't quite understand what I meant. He said, what do you mean unconscious bias? And I explained it to him, and when I finished, he said, oh, wait a minute. So you're saying to me that if I'm discriminating, and I don't know that I'm discriminating because it's unconscious, then I'm not really discriminating, am I? And I thought, actually, you are discriminating. But unconscious bias is still important, and it's something that really that makes us feel better about discrimination. But I always say to people, whether it's unconscious or not, it is still discrimination. But the bigger point is that discrimination remains, and if it remains, we need to be able to explore understanding of why that may be the case. And in my own research, I came up with this thing, and I thought, we need to look at other alternatives. And it occurred to me that, in actual fact, organizational culture may be the key here to understanding why discrimination is persisting. And organizational culture is an area that I like so much, that I have studied so much. The thought that what I have studied all my academic career may actually be responsible for the perpetuation of disadvantage, I thought was quite interesting. But then I explored it, and I thought, why would I think this is important? Of course, we know about the Macpherson inquiry following the death of Stephen Lawrence, which said, this is entrenched. This is caused by institutionalized cultural entrenchment and dislike and disadvantage of BME people. But we still haven't done anything about it. But also, as somebody who studied organizational culture, I began to think about it. Actually, the way culture is packaged or defined and packaged and translated to executives and managers as a way of managing, a way of effectively controlling the behaviors and the values of employees, that in itself has discriminatory undertones. For example, the way we define culture. Culture is commonly defined as shared values, values that are widely shared, intensely held, and clearly ordered. And this is strong culture for you. And if values are widely shared, you begin to ask the question, whose values are widely shared? It is the values of the dominant coalition. The dominant coalition often excludes the powerless. The powerless often are those people that are different, often by virtue of having different ethnicity or that are different in terms of that salient characteristic of race. So it is the capacity to then share those values and beliefs and assumptions. And many of those values and beliefs and assumptions are derived from the wider society. And the wider society is where ethnic minorities are already being discriminated against. So if you are taking those values from outside society and bringing them into organization, constructing them to become your organizational values, the people that are already discriminated against outside will become even more marginalized and discriminated against within. And I think that's why I thought, let us look at the wider society then to try and understand this point better. And I came across the British Social Attitudes Survey, which, as you would know, is a regular thing by Nat Sen. So the 2007 Social Attitudes Survey, 26% of British people say they are very or a little prejudiced towards people of other races. Now, this hasn't changed. It's been consistent. This survey has been there since for over 30 years, I think, and it hasn't changed. It hasn't gone below 25% at any point. It's always been 25 and above % of British people. They say they are a little prejudiced or very prejudiced towards people of other races. Now you think about it and you think, this isn't something that people are proud to admit. So if 25 to 26% of people are saying they are, the actual figure is likely to be higher. But that's the case. And then you do a gender split, 29% of men, 23% of women, and then you look at it from political party split, 33% of conservative voters versus 18% of Labour, 20% of Lib Dem, and then you look at it from EU referendum split. 34% of Leave voters say they are a little or very prejudiced against people or towards people of other races, and 18% of Remainers. More importantly, you look at the European Social Survey. I was in, I think it's 2014, this was. And 18% of British people agree that some races or ethnic groups are born less intelligent. That's almost 20% of people, 1 in 5. Say. Yeah. So they believe, fundamental belief, that some people are born less intelligent. In other words, the perpetuation of this stereotype then doesn't matter how good you can be, because you are born less intelligent. You couldn't possibly come into an organization and then become very intelligent, the perception. So you've got to work twice as hard to convince anybody that you are as intelligent as the next person. And 44% of people believe that some races or ethnic groups are naturally harder working. So almost half of the people believe that some people don't work hard. So it doesn't matter how hard you work. You know, the perception, the belief is that you don't work hard. If you then look at all these, you can see how you go into an organization and the culture becomes one that perpetuates disadvantage, you know, where you then have some of these things that become informal knowledge, that become beliefs, that become assumptions, that become ways of thinking and feeling and reacting, that then impacts on your capacity to make decisions that we then characterize as unconscious bias. But that is discrimination. That is packaged in a way that makes it easier to absolve responsibility. So culture then bestows capital, serious capital capital that comes in form of informal knowledge, that comes in the form of linguistic aptitude, the accent, the tone, the grammar, the personal style, that are only accessible to those that have ancestral advantage. The people that are outside those groups struggle. Doesn't mean they're never going to get it, but they struggle to be able to achieve similar levels of advantage. It's almost like running a race, a 100 meters race with Usain Bolt 5 years ago and having one hand tied behind your back. You've lost before you started anyway. And then if you then have a disadvantage before this race, then you simply have no chance in this world of ever meeting it. So that creates difficulties. So culture capital can then become linked to social capital because these people then are able to, because of all these factors that are bestowed upon you, you are able to develop social ties, these informal relationships and networks that then become translated into financial benefits or career benefits. Networking, really, that's all it is. People go out of their way to develop relationships and then to do things for others, with others, in the hope that in future they can draw on it. So it's almost like deferred reward. You get it, you do it today, you invest in it today, you draw on it in the future. But networking tends to be linked to demographic similarity. People tend to prefer to associate with people that are like them, which means that those that are dissimilar on the salient characteristic of race struggle to establish that. All the studies available will tell you that ethnic minorities go to organizations wanting to develop network and struggle to develop those networks because people don't want to associate with them. I remember many years ago, we had a colleague at Cardiff, and it was many years ago, it was going back to the 1990s, but I never forget that story, who was telling me, he said to me that when he was at Glasgow, he was at Glasgow University, that he was really, really shocked that there was this new guy who had gotten a lectureship, a Nigerian guy apparently, who'd become a lecturer at Glasgow. And he worked so hard to try to ingratiate himself with all the other people in the department because he thought, this is the only way I'm going to succeed. This is a networking thing. And that even his wife, they both agreed, they cooked for them and invited people. This was in the 90s, so maybe one might look at it in that context, I don't know. But they invited people, the people in his department, and said, come and have a meal in my house. And nobody went. And this guy was telling me that he felt so ashamed because when they were discussing it in the pub, people were saying, I don't know what they are going to give me there. I want to go there and eat something and maybe get killed or something. And you think to yourself, wow, that's so interesting. And he really felt it, he said. And he felt so bad that he was able to tell me that. But that's the thing about this developing networks. Sometimes they can become closed. It's difficult to do that. But again, it's not impossible to be able to do it, as hopefully we shall see in a few minutes or so. But then, these then become things that impact on organizations. If we agree that organizational culture can become a source of disadvantage, then you can see that in organizations where executives and managers try to manage their cultures, which is practically all large organizations, the one thing that people never get tired of is organizational culture. It's almost like I won the lottery when I chose to research organizational culture, because I've published on organizational culture throughout my academic career. For most people, you publish for 10 years in an area, and then you find that it's saturated, you got to find a new area. But every time I decide to write on culture, there is something new to write. Because practically every organization you visit, by the time you speak to the executives for 10 minutes, they will mention culture 10 times. The problem here is the culture. We need to change the culture. We need to manage the culture. And because they are all forever paying consultants to try and help them to manage culture. Then you begin to see how these things can impact on ethnic minorities, unless, of course, in context where culture management is designed to increase inclusion. And there's a company that I'm doing work with now which is doing just that. You know, the essence of culture management is to increase inclusion. I've picked out one example because this isn't what we're focusing on today. And that example is leadership. You know, leadership, again, perceptions of what constitutes good leaders, a good leader, they typically are white, male, heterosexual, and they have transactional styles within them, so that somebody who was more collegial may not be seen as a good leader in that sense, because there are deep-seated assumptions of cultural superiority that tend to benefit white men. You look at how it impacts on ethnic minorities. You look at the history of slavery. You look at the history of colonization. There's a lot of deep-seated assumptions that make it difficult for them to be viewed as good leaders or perceived as good leaders. And anybody that tries to change the status quo will soon be told off. There's a narrative that is every so often it rears its head, which is that white men are now an endangered species. Some of you would have heard that when Tesco chief executive, Tesco chairman said it in 2017. White men are an endangered species on company boards, which is really interesting because this is because people are beginning to challenge it and say, we have to have more women, we have to have more ethnic minorities, and then suddenly it's becoming difficult. And instead of having 100% white men, and you're now having 70% white men, so they are becoming an endangered species in that sense. You look at the evidence from FTSE 100 organizations, the Parker report in 2016, 8% of FTSE 100 directors are BMEs. Now, somebody may think 8% is brilliant, and at least that's what I thought when I saw it. 8% is rather good, given the circumstance. And then you look at the figures. The 8% actually includes a lot of people who are seconded in this country. There are BMEs from USA. Some people may be familiar, given your engineering links, with the woman who was, what was her name? Who was the chief executive of British Aerospace? Oh, forget her name. She's gone back to America now. LeSean? She's gone back to America. So she's included in that data. Yeah. So, and then there's another company, Anglo-American, which is South African based. And South Africa, they have affirmative action. So many of the black executives there would, by implication, would be included. So 8% isn't the real figure. The real figure, 2%, under 2% or about 2%, British ethnic minorities. Now that is incredible. So at the time, there were about 1,053 directors in FTSE 100 organizations, and only about 21, 22 of them were British BMEs. Now you look at it, there are approximately 4 million second and third generation BMEs. 22 of those people are board members in FTSE 100 organizations. Bear in mind that most of these companies are based in London, where upwards of 50, 60% in some areas where they are based are BMEs. So quite significant. There's something somewhere that is stopping people from progressing. And indeed, when they get appointed, they tend to get appointed in companies that are failing. When organizations begin to fail and you think, yeah, okay, let's get somebody, then you think, oh, okay, that's the best place to put them. Or departments that are failing. And research establishes that they tend to be blamed for poor performance, but are not praised for positive performance. They simply have all these difficulties that make it difficult for them. But the evidence also suggests that there are individuals who are successful. And this is where I come in, because I was part of a group that did a study a few years ago that looked at executives in FTSE 100 organizations. And I've since taken that forward and did quite a few things on my own where I've gone in and spoken to very senior executives in these large organizations. And one of the things that kept emerging was, surprisingly, the numbers of people that I saw, not quite at the director level that count as the 22 that I was talking about, but slightly lower down the line in these very large organizations, people who were doing well, and often quite young BME people. And I began to piece things together to try and understand why these people were succeeding in a context where a lot of people were failing. In other words, as I started today, I didn't just want to focus on the negative. I wanted to think about the positive, and I wanted to be able to theorize it, to write from it, and say, what is it that is making it possible for some people to succeed and others not to succeed? And this is where I came up with this idea of cultural entrepreneurs. Cultural entrepreneurs are really entrepreneurs within organizations as opposed to without, where your concept of entrepreneur has been popularized. These are people who take risk within their own organizations. They take charge of their own careers. They take their agency into their own hands, and they go out there and find what they have to do, and then they do it to be able to become successful. They work very hard at disrupting traditional ways of thinking, feeling, doing, and responding, and they try to deploy the same cultural resources that are designed to work against them. They try to deploy them to work for them. In many ways, and I take it back to my own experience, in many ways, that's when I looked at it, that's essentially what I tried to do. So I became promoted to the position of professor at Cardiff University, not necessarily because Cardiff University wanted to promote me at the time, but because I made it impossible for Cardiff not to promote me. So in a way, I think some aspects of what I've done would fit into that label of trying to use cultural resources, the same processes and systems that are designed to work against you, whether it is by design, I guess, or whether it is just by accident, but that are working against you, finding ways of using those same things to work to your own advantage. And then I try to find commonalities in the experiences of these people, by speaking to them and trying to get at what exactly is it that makes it possible for you. In a sense, what are the secrets of your success? And some of the things I came up with, I distilled it, and then I thought maybe this would be a good place to share it, given that there are young engineering students here that are hoping to go out and become successful in their own careers. And I thought the first thing that I found was that these people all had mentors, and they did not restrict their mentors to people like them. In other words, they weren't restricted by that thing about demographic similarity. So they reached out to people they felt could help their careers. And surprisingly, I know we talk about these things and we say how the problem may be white middle-class men. But actually, without engaging with white middle-class men, there is not an awful lot of change that you can achieve. And when you do, you'll be surprised at how many actually don't like the system that is working, but they haven't been conscious about it. If you approach them, if you are looking for a mentor and you approach them and put in a convincing case, my experience is that a lot of people will be happy to help you. And I'll talk a bit more about it. So approach somebody that you respect, inside or outside your organization. Now, demographic dissimilarity makes it challenging, but it doesn't make it impossible. So you have to manage those challenges. How does one do that? One would do that by making sure that you enter into those open conversations with your mentors. Talk to them about the difficulties. Be open and say to them, I realize that there will be times when you would have difficulty in speaking to me about issues, but please, it's better for you to tell me, and then make that communication, make it as open as possible, so that the people will understand that, because if you think about it, it's very, very difficult sometimes for somebody who doesn't understand the concept of race to now go out there and start speaking to somebody else about something that they have preconceptions about that may not have anything to do with the reality of the situation. Because people are worried. And if there's one thing we can do as organizations and an institution, it would have to be to address white fears about race. Because if you don't, nothing is going to change. When you speak to senior managers, and I'm doing a study now with a colleague of mine who is white, and he's been going out and speaking to senior university academics about mentoring. And some of the things that are coming out, I was reading the preliminary report the other day, interviews the other day. Some of the things that are coming out is that the white senior academics are saying, I don't really want to offend. I don't know what to say. So they end up not saying anything. And then you get academics, young academics, who are looking for guidance and looking for mentoring. But their superiors are not having the same type conversation with them because, frankly, they are worried. Everybody's scared. One of the most difficult things you can do to somebody now, we know that to be the case, is to accuse them of being a racist. Nobody wants to be seen to be a racist. So it's probably the worst thing you can label at somebody. You are a racist. And you say it. If you say to somebody, a white person, you're a racist, oh my God, you might as well kill them because they feel, how can I be? I am not. And they will do everything. They will tell you everything. But in actual fact, it isn't a conscious thing on their part. My point that I always say is, unless somebody is consciously anti-racist, has developed an agency to be anti-racist, then they are going to retain elements of racism in them, which is what we call unconscious bias. The only way you can tackle that is to be conscious about it and to think about how every action that we take can be construed as racist or racism, and then try to work on it and make that a central plank of your decision-making in everyday life. And if you don't do that, it's practically impossible not to be, because you are not aware of it. You don't know you are doing some of those things. And that's why it's important for us, if we have mentors, to speak to them, have an open conversation. Say, let's talk about it. Because it's not every ethnic minority person sitting down there waiting for somebody to take to court for racism. But if that's how a white person feels, then they don't want to go to court, and they don't want to say anything. So they keep it to themselves, which I think you will see when we talk about feedback, which is a very important aspect of what I am saying. Invest in your human capital. These people tended to go all the time, try to develop themselves. They will tell you, they say to me, you've got to take control of your career, nobody else will for you. You've got to be able to go out and learn something new whenever you can. Every time an opportunity arises, learn something new. Because it's only by doing that that you equip yourself to be able to get into these roles. And they also talked about social capital. They said you've got to develop your network. However hard it is, you have to develop your network. And I saw some people who said to me, I'll go into a meeting of senior managers in this company where I'm working. And every time I go in, I'm the only black person there, they said. And then I'll go in, and I developed this strategy, she said, I'll go into the room, and I'll go to, nobody will want to talk to them. Said, I'll go to them. I'll disrupt their thinking, their meetings. I'll go in the midst of them and say, hello, I am such and such. And then initially people think, okay, what do we say next? And then she engages them in conversations. There are some people that have the skill to do that. It's actually a difficult skill to develop. Some people can, others can't. Many ethnic minorities, by the very nature of their cultural issues, they find it difficult to just go in and start saying, hello, I'm this person and that person. But this woman said to me, and by the end of the conversation, they become my best friends because I've done the initial thing. I don't wait for them, because if I wait for them, I'll stay there by myself, and after about half an hour, I'll get so frustrated, I'll find a way to make an exit or I'll go into a room and just sit by myself and do something else. And I noticed that that's what I was doing, and I thought, I'm not going to do this again. I'm going to be more active, proactive, and go out and do that. And many of the other people that were there, that's what they were saying. You've got to learn what and who matters in your organization, which in a way is culture as well. You've got to learn to be assertive without being aggressive. One woman said, you've got to be careful so that you don't get labeled as the angry black woman. I didn't quite understand what that meant, but you got to so learn where to draw the line. Otherwise, they'll see you as the angry black woman. So challenge outdated cultural norms, where they exist. And if you have an opportunity to be a reverse mentor, agree to do that. Some organizations are doing this now, where they're saying, let's get a BME person to mentor senior executives and managers, because many of the things they don't understand. You go into a situation where somebody is quiet in a group. It's not necessarily because they haven't got anything to say, but it's because it's a cultural thing. They don't, no, they don't want to do that. So that reverse mentoring may make senior managers aware of that, and then it's their responsibility to tease out these people, seek them out and get them to talk or to contribute what it is they have to contribute. And often when they contribute, you find that they're actually very good, just that they don't go out and blow their own trumpets. And then they talked about the importance of resilience. Practically all of them said, you've got to be resilient. There's no point in going home and crying and saying, this has happened to me. No. You work harder next time. Even when they kick you back, you've got to keep going back. One woman called it bounceability factor. So just keep bouncing back, whatever happens. Be willing to go the extra mile. I know some of them kept saying the way we did it was to try and find difficult roles. Said in meetings when they say, who's going to do this? The most difficult one, nobody wants to do it. Said, one woman said, I always come up and say, I'll do it, however difficult it is. And then, because once I do it well, then I become noticed by the senior teams. Next time round, they come to me, and then it makes it easier, they said, to be able to progress in the organization. A very interesting one is the politics of feedback. Feedback is a strategic resource, and we think it's neutral, but it isn't neutral, because feedback is provided depending on the context and depending on the person or people involved. Often, feedback is based on, the efficiency of feedback is based on a demographic similarity. One of the reasons, this organization I was studying, it kept finding that BME people were not getting promotion, and even on second attempt and third attempts. And they brought in some people to try and study that, to find out why. And at the end of the study, they concluded that it was because of the quality of feedback they were getting. The BME people, when they're knocked back on promotion, it's not always because of race, by the way. Maybe it's because you haven't achieved all the competencies. And then because you haven't, then somebody then directs you and says, this is what I think you ought to do that. Then you get to that point where you will be able to achieve the competencies and get promotion. The BME people were not getting that. They were getting filtered feedback. Again, because people were worried. They didn't want to be in trouble. They didn't want to tell you, this is what you need to do. You've got to do this, got to do that. Even sometimes they swear and they do all the things that amongst themselves will be fine. But with somebody else, you are perpetually worried that I've got to be very careful here. I'm choosing my words very carefully. And at the end of the day, it doesn't actually help the person. They go away not knowing what it is they should do and not doing it. And next time round, they still get knocked back. So you've got to play the politics of feedback, as I call it. And the thing would be to encourage people to be as open as possible. Tell them what it is. One of the things I did when my younger daughter became a doctor and started a job as a foundation year doctor, one of the things I did as I said, you got to get all your consultants and say to them, and the senior people in your place, and say to them, please, whenever I do something, I want you to be honest and tell me, Even if I don't like it, I am not going to take it against you. But what I don't want you to do is just don't tell me all the negative things I've done. Please tell me how I can improve. A developmental type feedback, not just, yeah, right, you didn't do that, you didn't do that, you didn't do that. What can I do? What did I do right, and what can I do to improve? And if you can do that, and people can trust that they will be able to be open with you, maybe you have half a chance. Because it's a really, really difficult thing. And this is one area we have to improve. Whether it's universities or organizations, we have to be able to engage with managers, especially white managers, on feedback, on race and feedback. In other words, not everything you say to somebody will be construed as discrimination. If somebody is focused on, the feedback is focused on the job, it's focused on the things that people haven't done well, and more importantly, how they can improve to be able to get to the next level, then it couldn't possibly be discrimination. You've given them all you can. So that's quite important. And then be confident about your self-worth and contributions. You've got to sell yourself. How many instances, people who were saying to me that they realized that whenever they go to meetings or events or things, and they're talking to them, they would have done quite a lot of the job, but they go to the place and they keep saying, excuse me, we did. And other people will be saying, right, I led this area, and I did this, and I did this. I guess you can see that when you watch The Apprentice. You see, and I did this, I did this, I did this. And you're thinking, they're taking the credit. But we all did this together. Now, that sometimes is culturally based, but also gender-based sometimes. People don't want to say, oh yeah, it's me, it's me, it's me. But white men are very good at that, actually. And it benefits them, because then they are seen as leaders. They got leadership qualities. Well, you haven't. You're almost a follower. So people can learn that and say, yeah, I'm going to go out and say, this is the difference I'm making. This is what I contributed to this team. Seek opportunities to develop new skills wherever possible. There's one person that I met who was knocked back when she was the highest ranked person in the finance division of the organization which she was, and thought she was due for promotion. They didn't promote her. And instead of she was very angry about it, but one of the things she did was she said, okay, how do I get more skills? How do I make it more difficult for these people next time round? She asked for secondment, and she was taken to a completely different division outside her comfort zone. And she went there and spent a year. And she said that was the best thing that I did, because I learned a lot about the business. I was able to come back the next year and put a much, much stronger case. And it made it very difficult for them to be able to knock me back. So there are many things in that sense that people can and people are doing in organizations. I realize time is up. So essentially, we have talked about the problems of the labor market, and it's well known and it's well rehearsed. We also know that if we continue in the current way we are doing, which is essentially not talking about race, not doing an awful lot, that it would take a very, very long time to close the gap. If we wait for the government to do things, then we may never get there. At one point, I thought we were on our way to getting more from the May government. There was a time that it was a certainty that we would have ethnicity pay gap reporting. I don't know whether that is still the case now with the new government and some of the other things that people thought were going to happen. We know that there are issues, there are problems. When the Commission for Racial Equality was abolished, we essentially made race something that is not as important as it ought to be. And I don't think that we have the structures today to be able to change that. So effectively, individuals would have to take control of their own careers, and individuals will have to do things for themselves to try to find ways of succeeding against the odds. And my view is that this concept of cultural entrepreneurship will be the way forward, at least in theory, if not in practice. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much for extremely interesting and compelling talk there. So it's my duty now to open the floor for questions. So if you've got any questions for Professor Ogbonna, please raise your hand. Yes.
Thank you very much. I particularly appreciated the term bounceability factor. I think I'll carry that forward, if you don't mind. I'd like to ask, from the perspective of a potential mentor, what were the best practices you learned about from these mentees, about the mentors that they had?
Again, it was the idea that you make sure that your mentor is somebody who is interested in your career. Because of course there are two types of mentors. There's the official mentor, where the organization says, here is your mentor. And then the best mentors are the mentors you find yourself. Because you've approached somebody and then they are willing to do it. But more than anything else, it is the individual themselves that determine the quality of that relationship. It's your career, not theirs. The mentor's job is really to help you to position yourself in the best possible way to be able to take advantage of the labor market. So it's all down to the individual to try and drive that relationship. But the best mentors tend to be the people that you find yourself in the relationship. Does that answer the question?
This is a quick follow-up, briefly. What were the best practices that you heard about from the mentors of the people who you interviewed?
The best practices from the mentors themselves. The difficult one in that sense, because all you talk about is the quality of the relationship that the two parties have. So the mentors would often, my experience of the best mentors would be, they would often set you tasks and challenges for their next meeting you're going to have. And some of those tasks and challenges will be things that you do inside your organization or sometimes outside of the organization. You know, why don't you think about X, Y, Z? Next time we meet, report back on what you've done in this area. So I think it varies in that sense. But often the quality of the relationship is determined by the individual themselves, that is the career aspirant, because the mentor doesn't have a lot of time, and you've got to take advantage of it when you find it, and it is down to you to ask for what you want. Yes.
Thank you for your lovely talk. I have exactly followed up today in my colleague about finding the right mentor and a good mentor. It's not easy to find the right mentor from your career. How we can find it, how we can approach it, because good one is not available.
Yeah.
And how we can find it.
You'll be surprised. You know, what I always say to people is find somebody that, you know, whether it's somebody you met at a conference or you know about their work. You know, if you email people and put a convincing case for mentoring, you'll be surprised how many people that would say yes, they would do it. You know, many people I speak with will tell me that they never really refuse requests for mentoring. Because for one thing, most people want to grow the people in their area or in their discipline. So as an academic, if somebody was working in my area and wanted mentoring, you know, you are keen to do it because you want to grow that discipline. So the more people that are working in the area, the better for the discipline. But what you wouldn't do in some cases is to put in so much effort into developing that relationship. So it depends on the type of mentoring somebody's looking for. In academia, there are people who want you to be reading their papers when they've written it, as opposed to people who want you to talk about their careers and what they are doing, and then be able to say, this is the direction I think you should take. If it is to, please help me, can you read that paper and then tell me where I'm going wrong? Then that would be more difficult to find, because people don't often have the time to do it. But if it is that general, let's have a Skype meeting for half an hour or an hour and let's talk to you about what I'm doing, and then gain your insight into a variety of things. So I think most people would be willing to do it. My experience is that anyway. So it looks difficult, and it is difficult. But if you don't try it, you're never going to know. You'll be surprised, many people don't try, they don't ask. And when you don't ask, you don't get.
My question is, as a professor, somebody who works in
and universities, being aware of the challenges that students face regarding things like attainment gap, what do you think could be done addressing that specific matter? And then another tangent is that you say that you believe that organizations are not necessarily ready. That's why this whole concept of entrepreneur, the individual having to go and actually fight for the space. But what is missing within our institution for that change to happen, to come from the top and not the individual having to build the resilience? Because there is only so much resilience that the individual can actually build. And in a way, expecting BME to actually always build resilience, it's tangent on regarding things like mental health, and all of these sort of things.
I agree. It's a difficult one because if effectively you are absorbing the people who are creating the problem and pushing it back to the people who are already disadvantaged, well, which is why all I'm doing is looking at the experiences of the people who have made it, who have been able to make it. Admittedly, this is not something that would apply to everyone. Ultimately, institutions have to change, and institutions can only change when they integrate race as central aspect of their strategy. You occasionally get people come in and say all the right words, all the right things, but it is more difficult to do that. And the only way you can do that is to have the senior leaders. You will have to, in the university environment, you will have to come from the vice chancellor. They have to consider it important. If they consider it important, then they will do it. But unfortunately, there are competing interests. And race will have to always be at the bottom of those competing interests because it simply isn't important enough in comparison with the areas where they are measured. They are measured on gender, for example. They are measured on other areas. Even some other protected characteristics that are making quite, not enough, I have to say, but that are making significant inroads. For example, on I read the other day that Cardiff University has become the first university to develop single-sex hostels for LGBT people. They provide accommodation for them where they can meet like-minded people and where they would not be discriminated against. That's you may not think it's a major step, but for the people concerned, that's quite a major step. Excuse me, that the university considers it so important that they are willing to do things like that. But if it comes to the area of race and ethnicity, nothing gets done because it's not something that is universally shared in that sense. So yes, I agree. We shouldn't push the problem to the people that are already disadvantaged. But the only way we have any sort of development in the area or improvement in that sense is to look for legislation. And that legislation is not forthcoming. Because if it were, the CRE would still be there today. In terms of the attainment gap, the CEHR have recently done something, haven't they? It will be interesting to see whether that leads to any meaningful change in universities. There are means and ways that you can improve that, and universities have tried to. Universities are actually leading some of the areas. For instance, we talk about organizations now thinking about blind recruitment. We've been doing that in universities for the past 10 years. We mark by numbers. Quite what impact that has had on attainment, I would never know. Because even as you're marking by number, when you read the piece of work, you can still tell, not necessarily who they are, but you can tell their ethnic origins, or broadly speaking, where they are from. Because of those, again, received cultural capital that we talked about, the language, the accent, the grammar, and other things.
Natalie?
So it's kind of like you on this question, actually, but it seems like all of the traits of these successful people rely on them having a certain level of self-confidence in themselves already.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering how we as individuals can sort of facilitate them to have this self-confidence which they may be lacking for other reasons.
Yeah.
How we can try and facilitate that to enable them to go and do these things.
Yeah. Again, you are right. These are people, they tend to be particular personalities that tend to get these roles, and it becomes self-reinforcing in that sense. But there are aspects of it where, for instance, the example I used of the woman who said, initially I would go in there and I would just sit by myself and nothing happened. And then it occurred to me, I don't want to spend the next 30 years doing these, so I have to try something else. So this is somebody, again, you're pushing it back to the victim in a sense. It's somebody who then said, I'm going to go out and do something different. When it works, then it becomes self-reinforcing, and you can try and do more and more of it. But for some people, it's very uncomfortable. It's not something they want to do. It's not in their personality to do it. But often, when something is successful, you can begin to change your perception of what is the right personality to have. But I do take the point. As university students, of course, there are many things students can do. I encourage my MBA students to keep reflective logs of all the meetings they have, particularly group work, because one of the difficulties is you finish your degree, I don't know how it is in engineering, but in business, finish your degree, and then you go into an organization for employment, and then they start asking you about your experience of group work. Have you managed groups before? Have you done? You don't have the experience because you were doing a degree, for example. But you could then develop these logs over the 3 years of your degree or 1 year of your master's degree, and then at the end of it, you can, because you are reflecting on the process, at the end of it, it could become part of your experience base, because you are managing groups, you are dealing with diverse groups. Often you have groups of people from different parts of the world, different genders, and you're trying to manage them. And that could help you to develop some aspects, admittedly, for the entry requirements that organizations are looking for, and you may be able to speak confidently about that. But yes, I agree, it's pushing the onus back on the individual as opposed to changing the structure.
Time for one final question.
We've got a lot of students here, and I'd like to ask you about putting topics of race into the curriculum. Are you aware of how it's done in something like engineering, which is typically considered as fairly apolitical and wouldn't really see it as an actual home for those discussions? I think it should be.
Yeah, there's no reason why you shouldn't have a course of some sort that looks at some of these issues, not just on race, a diversity management course of some sort, or diversity and inclusion, where it cuts across all the other modules, where you talk about gender, disability, religion, sexual orientation, and so on and so forth. There's no reason why one shouldn't include that in the curriculum. And I think it's something that is many institutions should be doing. I don't think we do enough of this.
Is there anything like that in engineering management?
We do it in the MSc, but not undergrad level. So
That's of course something Natalie's been looking at quite closely over the last 2 weeks. So we've been looking at speccing that out, and something that Natalie was going to speak to LTEC about and Chris about, because I think it's a critical issue that we need to embed, across all our engineering disciplines, not just in a single, materials or mechanical, but across the first year portfolio potential.
So we do it at a master's level, but that's a very small group, so you can have a good dialogue and you can talk about these issues. And I find that when we talk about race, it has to be back and forth.
Yeah.
A circular discussion. And the problem with undergrads is so many. How do you? I don't know how we get the same quality.
Do they have tutorials in tutorial groups? No. So they don't have small groups where you can split them and.
In mentoring groups, we have academic mentoring groups with tutors, but then whether those tutors are able to facilitate discussion, I just don't.
But even at that, if you had lecture material and then reading material that encourages them to read certain articles and books or whatever, people begin to develop an awareness. But I think the most critical thing is that people just don't know. And when you don't know, it's like we were talking about unconscious bias. If you don't know you are doing that, your action or inaction itself may be part of the problem, then it's not something that impacts on your life. So by having those lectures, the benefits will be there, even if it won't be as good as it would be if you had small groups where there is that interactive discussion.
Okay. So that just leaves me to say, in my capacity as M2A Director and on behalf of the College of Engineering, to thank Professor Ogbonna for that fantastic talk today and for answering all our questions. So if we could just give a round of applause.
Thank you.